Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Introduction to Tinkercad for creating a 3D object with Technocopia. Please note this class is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for you to refer back to if needed. During this class, Eric will teach computer-aided design using Tinkercad. Tinkercad is a free and fun software system that allows users to build using basic shapes on an X, Y, and Z plane. It's a great way to learn the basics of 3D modeling and possibilities of 3D printing. Each student will be able to submit one 2.5 by 2.5 design for 3D printing at the library. These prints will be available at the library 2 weeks after the workshop date. We will contact you. Feel free to ask questions by unmuting yourself or using the chat, which I will monitor throughout the class. And with no further ado, welcome Eric.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Eric Sutman. I'm the operations manager at Technocopia. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great.
Yes.
Okay, so Technocopia is a makerspace right next to the library. We are on the corner of Myrtle and Portland in the printers building. We have 11,000 square feet of metal shops, wood shops, and digital fabrication, including 3D printers, which is a little bit what we're going to talk about tonight. Tinkercad is a software really primarily designed for producing 3D models that can be printed. There's nothing wrong with the 3D models that come out of 3D CAD. You can use them for other purposes. But really, I think Tinkercad came about sort of as 3D printing became more of a common technology, and folks wanted a more approachable way to create their own models. So let's talk a little bit about it. I just have a few short slides. Can everyone still see the presentation? Great. Okay. So what is 3D modeling, 3D printing? 3D printing is an additive process for building things. We build things by adding things rather than carving them away. The most common type of 3D printing that you will see is called FDM, or fused deposition material. I typically compare this to taking a hot glue gun and just very carefully swirling it around in spirals to build up layers. Little by little, this is done with plastic at a higher temperature, but in general, it's a very similar process. I'll talk about the others. The fused deposition modeling is the most common type, and that's certainly what most of the printers at Technocopia are, that the printer at the library is. But it's worth knowing the different kinds of printers available. So in more industrial settings, you'll commonly see laser sintering. This is a cool process where whatever you're building out of is basically, you can think of like a like a ball pit, right? Except it's tiny little grains, or a sandbox maybe, tiny little grains of plastic or metal with a binder. And thin layers are slowly added, and a laser comes around and zaps the different layers to fuse them together, and it slowly builds up that way. That's a pretty cool process. It's very industrial. You very rarely see it outside of an industrial setting. Certainly if you've ever seen 3D printed metal, almost 99% chance it was sintered. It was using this process. And then the last process I want to talk about is increasingly common. SLA printing, or more commonly, you'll hear it called resin printing. This is a process where, same as the other two, the piece is built up layer by layer. This is done with a UV sensitive resin. If you see the image that I have here, what's happening is at the very bottom of that little pool of resin, there's a screen. And this moving plate at the top brings itself right down to where it's just as high as it wants the layer. And that can be as thin as, we're talking like, boy, I'm going to get my scale wrong. Smaller than you can imagine. Very, very tight. And then the screen blasts light onto the layer and hardens all of the resin and fuses it onto the higher levels. Boy, I wish I could remember the resolution. But it's an exciting type of resin. For a few years, it was very niche. It's becoming increasingly common. And it has, even though it generally prints smaller things, it has the bonus of printing sort of more detailed, more finely detailed pieces. A lot of folks who are into, say, miniatures, whether it's maybe dollhouses or whether it's more board gaming sort of miniatures, they tend to really gravitate towards resin printing or stereolithography, SLA. So why do people get so excited about it? Well, aside from the fact that you're really printing plastic parts at home, you can do some stuff with 3D printing that you just aren't going to do other ways, right? You can print pieces. If you were to imagine the way you might create a mold for some of these pieces, it would be nearly, maybe not impossible, but boy, close to impossible. And that's because, if you imagine something molding the outside of this, to mold the inside, it has to wrap around. When it wraps around, you're not going to be able to pull it out. You can print pieces into place, like the links in the top right here. We have sort of a rough mesh fabric, which is flexible and moves. And that's just printed right into place. It's just created that way. And then, of course, you can create very elaborate, precise pieces like we see in the bottom right through computer-generated software that creating by hand might be a lot more time-consuming and might require a lot more hand skills. So I wanted to add this slide just because I know what a common question around 3D printed pieces is, what's kind of, is it just solid plastic? What does it look like? There are a bunch of different patterns that you can fill in the inside of the plastic with. And depending on what the piece is, it can be almost entirely air, or it can be entirely solid. I'll just quickly, I have a couple very small pieces, right? These are printed on my home printer, so they're very small, so pardon me. This is an adapter, a mouthpiece adapter. And this is very small. It has to be a little bit flexible, but because of the size of this, right? I designed this and I 3D printed it at home. It's entirely solid. It wouldn't make sense for it to be empty. It would be too weak, and it's already thin enough. However, right? So this is. I'll show this on the screen share in just a minute. My kids painted it, so maybe it's a little hard to see. It's a little oil barrel. It's very lightweight, and the reason is because it's about 95% air. But it's perfectly strong, right? Like, it's not 95% air, and so I could crush it. It's 95% air. but because it's been intelligently filled in, it's still structurally very solid. All right. There are downsides to 3D printing. One of the most common downsides is that you can sort of see what's going on in this case, right? Like we talk about overhang. Overhang when we have parts sort of bridging out into nowhere, right? If you go back to that idea of taking a hot glue gun and just moving it around. Well, if you do that in the air, right? If you just squirt a hot glue gun in the air, you're going to find that it's just flops down onto the table, right? And so when we bridge outwards for 3D printing, we have to do so in a very controlled environment. This can vary between the different types. Overhang is mostly a problem with FDM, but that being the most common type of printing, it is a very common problem. We normally get around this by reorienting the piece when we print it. Maybe you can print it on the side. Maybe you can add supports. The software that generates the instructions for the 3D printer can add supports that help prevent this. And then one more note on 3D printing before I move on. The other biggest downside is that it does take a while, right? It's very common for prints to take 4 or 8 hours. And if it's for something very small and very common, right? Like if you wanted to replace, something like a light switch plate, right? That would take a very long time. It would require sanding and cleaning up. You could go to Lowe's and buy one for, I think there's 70 cents, right? That's not practical. But if you have come up with something totally unique that only exists in the digital space, or you can't just go out and buy at a store, there's something really magical about being able to press play and have it appear on the printer next to you. So that's sort of like the time and place. It's if you're prototyping, every prototype is a one-off, right? If you're messing around with shapes and sizes and trying to get it just right, there's no other way to fabricate it quite as quickly or easily. Tinkercad. The capital CAD in Tinkercad stands for Computer Automated Design. So how does that factor into this 3D printing? CAD is a very old concept. It's been around since, I believe, the 60s. However, it really took place it really sort of took hold in the 80s when Autodesk, same company that created Tinkercad, by the way, created AutoCAD. AutoCAD is now pretty standard in the architectural space. You will find lots of different types of CAD programs out there. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. What makes them different from something like this, Maya, right? What makes CAD a little bit different is that if you look here, you'll see that this is very technical. It's a floor plan. It's very precise. CAD tends to be geared towards mechanical accuracy, whereas most 3D modeling software is geared more towards creative expression. And so the set of tools that are in there are going to be different in that way, and the tools that are available for precision are going to be different. So if you have Autodesk for mechanical things and you have Maya for artistic things, why would you bother with Tinkercad? Well, the downside with both of those programs is that they can take years to become proficient, right? They can be very intimidating. Tinkercad is specifically designed to get you moving quickly. It's also a lightweight program that you can pull up and create things quickly. If you have a simple design to make, Tinkercad will get you there more quickly. You don't have to fuss with the more heavyweight programs like Maya, right? Another thing is that there's some jargon that shows up, some specialized terms that come up in 3D modeling, whether it's in CAD or in more traditional 3D software. That jargon can be a barrier of entry. And so having it in somewhere more approachable, like Tinkercad, is useful. And of course, AutoCAD and Maya are very expensive. They are industrial and professional tools. Tinkercad is just out there for free. You can just create an account. All right, so let's take a little bit of a look at Tinkercad. This is my fairly clean. I did want to show you this. This is my oil drum that I printed for my kids. Actually, I should have grabbed the tiny pallets that this goes on. My 4-year-old has a toy forklift, so that's what the oil drum is for. So this is a very simple. This is you can sort of see how this would be built out of rings and a couple cylinders. This is very quick. This is the other thing that I built for my son's pallets, and this is a milk crate, and this is a little bit more. You can see this is a little bit more involved, right? This prints at this size. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see that, but it prints pretty well.
Terrence wants to know if that's for the milk crate challenge. I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it's not. I'm not familiar with that either.
Yeah.
Although maybe I've got a head start. I'll have to look into that.
Oh, apparently it was on TikTok. There you go.
Maybe in miniature. Maybe in miniature. Okay. So, here's a quick look at just how ambitious folks get with Tinkercad. You can see, if you really put in the time, you can make some really cool, beautiful stuff. Yeah. So it's a great way to get started, but the ceiling is still very high. All right. So let's take a tour. Where am I trying to go? There you go. All right. So this is Tinkercad. Does everyone here have a Tinkercad account? Hopefully. Now would be the time, if you do, to log in. Awesome. Yeah, now would be the time to log in. I will go ahead and sort of get started, but if you want to jump in, log in, and follow along with me, I'm happy to stop and take questions at any point. All right, so when we deal with 3D software, we will usually see a grid like this. This This tells us not just things like how far, you can imagine with graph paper how far things are away from each other. But more importantly, if I'm way over here and I have something in 3D space, you can imagine how disorienting this could quickly become. So typically, 3D software will feature a work plane. And you can think of this just as the ground, right? I think that's fairly intuitive. This helps us orient ourselves to our piece. Otherwise, we can get turned around very easily. The work plane in Tinkercad uses the metric system. So by default, each of these squares is 1 millimeter, and the thicker lines show a group of 10, so a centimeter. That is, in fact, the size that it will print to by default in 3D. So you can think of that as a real-world measurement. If I want in the bottom right, I can edit that. I can tell it that I want to work in inches. I can also tell it that I want to work in bricks. I won't go into too much detail here, but there is a workflow for converting your designs into an approximation using standard building bricks, i.e. Legos. I would recommend, if you're doing things for 3D printing, keep it in millimeters. That tends to be how 3D works. We can increase and decrease our grid as we need to, but I'm going to leave this the way it is. I can also, so if I pull in a box here, you'll see that as I drag it around, it pops from one box to the next. That's because we have grid snapping turned on by default. That's very useful. I would not just start turning that off without an explicit need. However, if we come down to the bottom right, we can set snap grid. We can actually make it bigger, or we can make it smaller, and we can go, down to 1/10 of a millimeter, and we can even turn it off entirely. But I will say, do that at your own risk. I would say 90% of the time, you're going to want to probably keep it with that default 1 millimeter setting. It's the most intuitive. So moving from the work plane, let's talk about our shapes. We have this menu on the right-hand side for various shapes. You can see that, there's a lot of familiar shapes. So Valentine's Day is coming up. We have a heart. There's a ring. Here's a text box. There are a whole gallery of these, literally. This is just the basic shapes. If we look at this drop down, we can find that there are a variety of of shapes available. Some of them are basically pieces of a model in and of themselves. This is all well and good, but it's really hard to build things with just the same size of blocks. So if I click on the shapes, we'll see that I get this menu just to the inside of my preview plane, or preview window, that has a whole bunch of properties options. With a box, which you will use probably most of the time, it's a very, very standard element. These top two are for putting on a bevel to your edges. So I can increase the size of my bevel. This is in millimeters, so I'll give it a 5 millimeter bevel, and we get those nice rounded edges. If I increase and decrease the number of steps, what that's going to do is it's going to basically roughen up my bevel by changing the number of jumps it makes to make that curve, right? So 3D shapes traditionally are made out of flat triangles in space. So there's not really any real curves. So if I want it smooth, I have to just basically add more triangles. And if I don't want it smooth, I can bring those down to basically nothing. So the other three on the box are fairly self-explanatory. We can work with length, we can work with width, we can work with height. If I turn this 90 degrees, in some cases, you might expect that this would change. It will not. That is to say, if it's 35 inches wide, that does not track with a direction on my grid. That tracks with my box. So in some programs, in Inkscape, for instance, if you were to turn a shape, it will reconsider what the width and the height are. In Tinkercad, that's not the case, right? The width and the height, if I have a box that's 25 long and I turn it, it's still 25 long. And it's always going to consider it that way. That's important in 3D. It would be very confusing the other way. Each different object has a different set of properties. There's so many that you're just going to have to test out most of them. I'll show you a couple of the really core ones. So text is pretty straightforward, right? We have a text field here. I can put in some text. They have a few different options that you can pick. A sans serif, a monospaced sans serif, serif. And the multi-language is very similar. It just has more accented characters available. More, yeah, a much larger number. So you can see that we don't have sliders for the width and the length here. We do have a height. However, that doesn't mean that we can't adjust the width and the height. It just means that they haven't put it in the properties. They don't expect you to do it that way. If I'm looking at my piece, there are boxes all along the side. If I hover over one of those boxes, they turn red. And then I can use that to resize it to whatever shape I want. I can see what shape, I can see what size that is, right, by looking at the axes. And I can actually even click on that and then type it in. So I can say this is 25 tall, and this is 50 wide. You might notice that when I did that, I stretched and I squished my text. And this is something we often don't want to do with text because it makes the letters look funky. And if we have other text, they're not going to match. What I can do for that is I can use this corner. Well, yeah, I can go back to my corner and I can hold down Shift. And if I hold down Shift while I drag that corner, it's going to force the it's going to force it to be the same ratio of height and width. So they'll scale proportionally and it won't deform. Oops. All right. Just quickly, we have a similar bevel on our text. This is similar to the bevel on the box, but it comes out. You'll see it actually grows the shape. And if we increase the number of segments, you'll see why. We can actually make some pretty cool, pretty dramatic bevels that way. Whereas if we rounded it on the inside like we did with the box, it would be much skinnier. You'd have a much less attractive final product. We can talk about the ring. The ring has a different radius, that is the distance from the center point to the edge. It has a tube width. Again, all of this is in millimeters. We can increase the smoothness with the number of sides. And we can increase the smoothness in a different direction on the ring side with the number of steps. So all of this, you can jump in and play with. I'm not going to walk you through all of these just because there are very many of them. And some of them you'll find don't have any options at all, right? The heart doesn't have any options other than color. So let's talk about how we can build more complicated shapes with these pieces. Building in Tinkercad is sort of a matter of addition and subtraction. If I have two boxes and I put them together like so, I can select both of them. I'm holding down Shift and clicking on both of them. And I can come up to this tool here to group them together. And in that way, I can add them together and create one new piece that moves and acts as one piece. I can also subtract pieces. So if I add another box, and I'll pull this the same way I have been, but I'll show you just up on the properties at the very top. I conspicuously didn't talk about this. If I switch this to a whole, you can think of that as being subtracted. So if I line them up again, right, Shift to select both of them, and now I group them together, you'll see that the whole cuts out of my original shape. So this is, this is the basic language for building items in Tinkercad. Once my combined shapes, I can then combine again. So I'll take my strange looking L, I'm going to convert it to a whole, and then I can even chop that out of this, right? And I can slowly make more and more elaborate shapes in that way using the group button. And if I decide that I've made a mistake, let's say I put my L in the wrong place, I can actually ungroup it and I can undo everything I've done. So you can always come back to your original pieces in Tinkercad. I'll just quickly, I'll show you that, right? So we have our original boxes. And we can then, you know, we can always go back and build it back up. Oops. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on this so far? Great. Okay. Please feel free to interrupt. So I'm going to quickly walk you through X and Y axis. That's a great question. So Terrence asks how we move the camera along the X and Y axis. So if we use our left mouse, we're going to be selecting. If we use our right mouse click, we're going to be pivoting. If we use the middle mouse or the scroll wheel, if we scroll, we'll zoom. But if we press, we can move left and right and up and down. It's this sort of shifting motion. Between that and the scroll in provides us our quickest way to maneuver around. So short answer is you press and hold the middle mouse button to move along the X and Y axes. Although I think technically it's the X and Z axis, but that's irrelevant. You can also come up, I'll say this too, you can also come up to the top. I don't tend to do this a lot, but there's a box here that you can just actually drag around if you want to reposition. And then press the home to go back to a default view. So I'm going to just sort of quickly demonstrate two different ways that we can build the same item. It's a very, very simple chair. I just want to show you the sort of two different philosophies, and they should be pretty straightforward. So if we think in an additive or subtractive way, if we start thinking, if we build this box in an additive way, building up pieces, what I can do is I can, and I'm just going to do this from memory, so pardon me while I breeze through this. What I can do is I can start putting together pieces. I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate it. Little by little, building them up. This, I think, is the most intuitive way of building. Oops. Let's see, it's misaligned here. There we go. All right. So what you can see is that I've just taken a bunch of blocks, stuck them together, right, and made a chair. This is a little bit more like thinking with Lego pieces, right? Oh, I have one piece misaligned. This is probably the sort of default way of thinking and building up items. But it's important to be able to think in terms of subtractive building as well. So I'd like to just quickly show you another approach for building that same chair. I'm just going to make a main shape and then carve away the pieces to get the exact same end result. So if I start bringing in these whole pieces, I'm going to use the align tool for this. So I'm going to shift select and I can come up to this top bar and go to align. I'm going to see these 3 dots. These will let me line up my pieces in various ways, in the middle, to one side, etc. And I can use this to very quickly place a block here and cut out my seat. I can do the same thing. To align pieces to cut out the bottom. And voila. So these 2 chairs are exactly the same. It doesn't, it doesn't particularly matter, to me or to, to Tinkercad that this one is built, by taking 6 different pieces and gluing them together, and that this is by taking one big piece and subtracting out, three other pieces. The reason that you would use one versus another is simply what shape you're looking to get and what shapes are available to you. If I want something that has, a rounded, a circular edge, I'm not going to get, let's say I want something like a dome, right? I'm never going to get a dome by subtracting, right? It's there. The pieces aren't there. I'm only going to get it by taking a sphere, maybe I cut part of it off and then adding it to something else. However, if I want the opposite of that, like if I wanted to make a satellite dish, right, the inside of a satellite dish, I'm never going to get that by adding. I'm only ever going to get that by subtracting out that rounded shape. So it's helpful to be able to think in terms of both, as that's what's going to give you the flexibility to get to the shape you ultimately want. So at this point, I can either, we can either, answer some questions if you are working in Tinkercad right now and would like to ask some questions. Or I could keep going and talk a little bit about the how you would go about learning more in Tinkercad. Is there a preference there?
Anybody have questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Tomo. Sorry, I was late.
No worries.
Not a
Welcome.
problem.
Thank you. How long does it
worries.
take for you to print the chair?
To do what to the chair?
3D print the
Oh,
chair?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on a lot of variables. It's a complicated question. I've never, I kind of wish I knew the answer to this. I would expect this chair, if I were to 3D print this, I would expect this to take maybe 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours. just because it's fairly small. If I scale it up, it could grow very quickly. You'll also, with 3D printing, you will also find that more elaborate shapes can take longer. So for instance, if I were, here, I'll try and explain it this way. If I take something like this, this is a free draw tool, right? And I come up with a tool like this, right? If I decide for whatever reason that this is what I want to print, right? Even if this is, small and has less material, you can imagine that because it's so complex, it's going to take the 3D printer a longer time to track around this entire line. And so one of the factors that you have to take into account when you consider how long a print is going to be, and actually, this can even factor into how successful the print will be, is how long it's, how complicated each layer will be. So that's why it's not always, you can't say, well, this many grams is going to take this long to print. I find there are just too many factors to be able to predict that.
I did post in the chat some instructions on how to download Cura Lulzbot edition. So you can throw your design in there and it can give you an estimate of how long it'll take based on the settings. So you just want to make sure you follow our settings. And we have a TAS workhorse, so you want to make sure you select that when you're setting it up. And that'll give you an estimate, which is helpful, especially, we limit our prints for 4 hours. I mean, if you do submit us a print that's longer than 4 hours, we will contact you and work with you to either resize it or, have you submit a new one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that's a good segue into sort of how you would then get those prints to the library. In Tinkercad, you would, in order to get the files that you would then submit to the library for printing, you'd come up here to the top right for export. And for 3D printing, right, 3D printing section, you're going to want to select an STL. This is the standard file type. .obj and .gltf. These tend to be used for other things. .obj tends to be used for digital 3D work a little bit more. It's an older format. It's a simpler format. But for printing, definitely go with STL. That is very standard. I wanted to show a couple other resources. Since we do have someone in the house who I think has an interest in Legos or in brick building.
There is
Tinkercad
a question, Eric. What about importing models into Blender?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you're working with Blender, Blender will take any of those. Blender is happy to take an object, an STL or a GLTF.
What is Blender?
Sure. Yeah, great question. Blender is a free and open source 3D modeling software. It is very powerful. It's a difficult software to use. It doesn't follow a lot of software conventions. It's an unusual software, but it is powerful enough that folks will use it not just for 3D printing and games, but also for even filmmaking and for general CAD purposes as well. It's a very powerful tool. High learning curve, but very powerful. And there's some good tutorials out there. Yeah. good question. So I just wanted to show quickly that there are a couple options built into Tinkercad where we can see what our shapes would look like. This is geared, I think, a little more towards like Minecraft. It can take a 3D design that you make and give you a plan for how to construct that in Minecraft or out of building blocks a la Legos. I believe that you can, yeah, increase the resolution depending on your scale. But if that's something that interests you, it is a very cool little addition that Tinkercad includes. And then we would just pop over here to standard Tinkercad to go back to our original design. There's also, I want to say, when you're saving your file in the top right here, Tinkercad will automatically give your file a unique name. So surprising biggery. I can just click on that and rename it, right? And then when I click the Tinkercad home page or home link and come back to my dashboard, I'll find it here. Tinkercad will auto-save your work for you. You don't have to worry about saving it. It's saving your steps along the way. And like I said, it will automatically give your design a unique name. So you will be able to find it again. When you have a tool you like, I think I actually shared this. And it even got copied a couple times. One of the coolest things about Tinkercad is the ability to not just share your own designs, but find other designs that other makers have made. So let's say, oh, what looks like fun. Boy, I'm kind of curious about that car. We could take this car and we could download it and we could 3D print it. Let's find one that'll let us make a copy of it. This, yeah. So here we have these two superheroes. On this one, you'll see the blue button. We have a blue button here for copy and tinker. So I can download the raw files to 3D print them. Or I can make a copy of this and start playing with this file all on my own, right? So I can start making adjustments. I can, obviously I can recolor it. But I can adjust for height. I can, adjust for scale, and I can get it to where I like it a little better, and print and go from there. That's really helpful if you're working on very complicated parts, right? Where someone might have already done part of the work for you. You can export this file and then import it into another project that you're working on. And in that way, you can not just work with someone else's project, but incorporate that work into your own and build it together to make something even more complicated. So I would definitely encourage you to spend some time in the gallery. There's some really, as you can see, there's some really amazing stuff in there. Tinkercad also has a lot of lesson plans. So, for continuing to use Tinkercad, they have a lot of resources for particular projects that includes not just 3D printing, but of course they also have branched out recently into coding and circuitry. There's a whole ton of resources that are available here. And with anything else, you know, as with anything else these days, you can find a lot of tutorials, you know, online, on YouTube, like I think this is going to be. That pretty much covers it. I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the form submission. So everyone who has signed up for this class is you know, welcome to submit a print to the 3D printing service that the library offers, and the first print will be complimentary on the house. That does not have to just be something that you made in Tinkercad. You can go to one of these resources like Thingiverse or Yegi, and you can send that to the, you know, send that through this submission form. Terrence has a good question. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. So there are some guidelines that I want to make sure we cover. As Jen mentioned before, nothing longer than 4 hours. I think that's going to be pretty easy to stay within. This 13 centimeters cubed is the sort of size limitations. So that's 13 centimeters, 130 millimeters. It's roughly 5 inches, if that's more helpful. There's a lot you can do with that. So it's a pretty cool deal. You can, you know, pick your color. It's under step 2 is the submission form. I have it up over here. And I think, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong. For this, it would be helpful if under this link URL, if you would just write Tinkercad student, and that would help identify for the librarians who are printing this that you are a student from the Tinkercad class. Terrence mentioned that maybe you're not able to get to the library.
I think if you just reply to the confirmation email or emailed me directly, I'll put my email in here. I'll see what we can do. Okay. So that's that. And then it's something I want to mention. You know, when you're designing, you can pick whatever color you want. You can pick multiple colors, but when you 3D print, we have a 3D printer that it can only print one color at a time. And so the page prior that Eric was on has our selection of colors. And then, of course, right here, there are drop-down menus. You can just pick your color. We ask that you do pick 2, just in case we've run out of one. It hasn't happened yet. But you pick your first choice and your second choice.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Quick question. So each square on the grid is equal to 1 millimeter?
Yes.
Well,
yep.
Right, you say you can convert it into inches too, right?
Yes. Yep.
So I think it'll be a little simpler for me to view the inches for the moment.
It's more intuitive. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you come down,
4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, so if you come down to the bottom right and hit edit grid, you can just select inches under units.
Okay.
And it might be helpful to just put in a round number. You know, we can say 10 inches by 10 inches.
Okay, so
one thing.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so one thing that's worth noting here. Yeah, no, I think we're thinking the same thing. When we deal in inches, we tend to deal with not tenths of inches. We tend to deal in eighths. or 16ths or, you know, halves. Yeah, you will, you know, instead of thinking in sets of 10, you're going to be thinking in sets of 8. So that is one adjustment you'll want to make if you switch from millimeters to inches.
So it would be, okay, so first off, so each, how many inches does each larger block contain?
Yeah, that's the 8. That's the 8.
So,
How many? Sorry. Sorry. So each larger block here is 1 inch.
okay, each larger block is 1 inch. Okay.
Yeah, and then there are 8 smaller blocks within that.
So I can just switch it to 12 inches. Like,
yep.
So the entire grid would be 12. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off. You're right. Yes, in the grid properties, if you put in 12 in the width and the length, you'll get 1 foot.
Okay, so yeah, that makes a little more sense. Thank you.
Understandable. Yeah.
My brain's starting to hurt now.
It's a lot, and I know I went
good.
quickly. So if there's any other questions, you know, please, please.
Thank you. Well, it's good that my brain is hurting because that means I'm challenging myself.
That's right. You need a little of that.
Yeah.
Well, are there any other questions, comments? No? All right, Eric, you're good?
Okay. All right.
All right, well,
We're all
thank you,
good.
everybody. I'm just going to stop the recording.